Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to a Climate Emergency Centre Wednesday webinar. We have a real heavyweight in the house who's been advising, campaigning, and raising awareness for the environment for many years. Shaun Spiers, who's director of the Green Alliance, and they advise and support many large groups from governments, local governments to NGOs and all sorts. But Sean's also had, helped with a lot of different things from credit unions to CPRE, you might mention a little bit. But without too much further ado, Shaun, thank you so much for coming. Tell us about the great work of the Green Alliance and some more, an overview of UK environment politics. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. Uh, I'll talk a bit about Green Alliance and then kind of give my take on where we are in politics at the moment. I did. You reminded me that in the blurb I sent across, I said that I would be optimistic. Green Alliance has a set of values, and one of them is that we are optimists. So I'm sort of contractually mandated to be optimistic. We just developing a new 5-year strategy, and there's been lots of debate about whether we can still be optimists. I think it's hard, but on the other hand, if you think that you are, if you exist to try and make the world a better place and combat climate change, there's not much point in going around sort of thinking we're all doomed and we've got no chance. So we do cling on to that optimism. Green Alliance was set up in 1979. It was, at the time, it was viewed as a sort of bridge between the new environmental movement that was getting going at the time, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, etc., and politics. And there did seem to be a mismatch that the campaigns on the street weren't landing and having an impact on political debates in the Commons or in the government. So that was what Green Alliance was set up to do, and also to be a bridge to businesses that were beginning to think more about their wider environmental footprint, and around that time, I guess, lead and petrol and ozone layer and so on. And Green Alliance has always been about landing policy ideas politically, about not just having the sort of fantastic ideas that stay on a shelf, but about how they can have a political impact. And I guess there are two strands to our work. One is as a think tank, and like any think tank, we have to raise money to work on particular areas. We don't have a lot of core funding, but we work on resources, which is one of the only NGOs that really, I think WWF is probably the other one, that are still working on resources, and particularly trying to push for a circular economy. And we have a circular economy task force with a group of businesses which has been going for 12 years that's also committing to try to get a more circular economy. I'll say a little bit about that later in terms of the politics. Natural environment was an area where Green Alliance didn't work till about 10 years ago. And then the National Trust approached Green Alliance saying, we've got the biggest membership of environmental or conservation organizations in Europe, but they don't appear to be having the impact they should have, with sort of millions of members of the National Trust, the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, Woodland Trust, and so on. And could Green Alliance give a kind of lift to some of those, kind of get some ideas that would land in politics? So that's another area of work, and particularly we've been working there on farming policy. And again, I'll come on and say something about that. Obviously, you'd expect climate and energy. I think in climate and probably the whole area of policy, there's probably a slight disjunction between the urgency which people on this call feel and some of the natural moderation that Green Alliance puts across in our policy prescriptions. And I'm well aware of Bill McKibben's line that winning slowly is the same as losing, and we all know on this call how severe the climate emergency is. But I think Green Alliance's niche in a larger environmental ecosystem is to try to land ideas which are going to have leverage in government and with politicians who, with a few exceptions, Green Party politicians, Ed Miliband, there's a few who kind of wake up in the morning and think about climate and think about the environment. Most politicians aren't thinking about that, and most voters aren't thinking about that. So you need to find a way to get the ideas to land. I remember 5 or so years ago, there was a big debate in the environment movement about net zero, and a lot of the organizations were campaigning. I think Extinction Rebellion was campaigning for net zero by 2030. A lot of the science says 2050 is too late, etc. But at the same time, what Green Alliance was saying is that whether it's 2040, 2050, or 2060, we're off track. And how can we bring about the practical policies that will get us on track and try and get those sort of S curves where where things become cheaper? And I think one of the interesting things about climate change is every time you look at the problem, it kind of gets more daunting and seems more serious. And we've seen that with extreme weather this week and kind of child dying in Italy of heat stroke and terrible forest fires across Europe and even in Scotland. But also, when you look at the solutions, they become more easy. And 80% decarbonisation seemed really ambitious when the Climate Change Act was set up. Now net zero seems possible, not only in the UK but across the world. And the price of offshore wind has come down much. I think only Greenpeace predicted how affordable offshore wind would be, and the government certainly didn't expect it. And we're seeing the price of EVs dropping massively, the price of solar dropping massively, China investing hugely in the green industrial revolution. So the solutions become easier, but I think Green Alliance's niche is definitely not to be sort of outliers, not to be the Extinction Rebellion, the Greenpeace, but to be the people who can sell ideas into government.
I
So
think
that's
that's a really good point, Sean, that things are gradually over time changing and there is some improvement. I think there's an Oxford professor woman who's written a book saying when you follow the curves, things are starting to improve, even though it looks really bad now. We've got to give people a bit of hope, and I'm glad you're talking solutions at Green Alliance. Thank you. Over.
and there's a book coming out which is on my to be read pile from I forget the guy from Exeter University called Positive. I think it's called Positive Tipping Points, and that's the whole. Can we get to the point where it'd be daft not to buy an electric vehicle if you want a vehicle, not to put in a heat pump if you're replacing your boiler, and there's some hope that you can get that way. So those are the main policy areas we work on. I should also say transport is one where we convene a round table of all the main environment NGOs working on transport. And lastly, the economy, greening the economy. And we did a big project on the Dasgupta review. Unfortunately, we've lost the funding for that now, but to try to get the Dasgupta review on natural capital to kind of land more with government. It was commissioned by the Treasury, unlike the Stern report, which was launched jointly by Gordon Brown and Tony Blair at a time when I don't think they were getting on particularly well. The Dasgupta review was launched by Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, and I think David Attenborough, and the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak was nowhere to be seen. And although Kemi Badenoch wrote the foreword to the report, I don't think she actually read it. It certainly hasn't. She certainly hasn't internalised it. But we've done work on the economy, and I think more generally, I think we just think that given the government's number one mission is economic growth, and we might want to come on and debate what that means, and given the kind of clear concern across the country about the cost of living and the state of the economy, if we want to land environmental ideas, you've got to be able to talk Treasury language and talk to the concerns that MPs will be picking up for their constituents and their surgeries about low wages, difficulty of heating homes, putting food on the table, etc., etc. So we have a head of economy. The last theme is politics, and the politics of Green Alliance has grown a lot. I've been at Green Alliance 8 years. When I started, I think we had 12 or 13 members of staff, and that's been, Green Alliance. I've been a member for over 20 years, and it was a small NGO. We grew quite quickly following Brexit. Green Alliance set up a coalition of the 12 main environment groups in the country called Greener UK to try to get the best possible outcome from Brexit. 80% of British environment laws were set in Brussels, all of farming policy, all of fisheries policy, chemicals policy, etc. So it was really important that the environment movement got its act together and influenced Brexit. And we did. We got out of that. We got the Environment Act. We were the only sector that got a serious change to the EU withdrawal bill to commit to an Environment Act. And we got it wasn't entirely us, but the environment sector was successful in getting a reform to farming policy, which is based on the principle of public money for public goods, rather than just paying farmers to farm. So that was that kind of raised Green Alliance's profile, and we've increased steadily in size. And I have to say, we sort of benefited from Extinction Rebellion and the whole rise of the salience of environmental issues around 2017, 2018, 2019.
Shaun, I think that's a key point that I met you at Chris Church's kind of 50 years of the
Yeah,
environment movement, with some big heavyweight names like yourself and Jonathan Porritt and others there. And Chris Church was saying, but I think some of the points that some of the panel made was that us in the NGO and other sort of, think tank groups have been able to push further because of the activists on the street and at ground level pushing action and the media. And then we've been able to push further with the government saying we need action. That's a very good thing to recognise, that we all work together in various ways.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that you have all sorts of debates about kind of the role of direct action more recently, but that upsurge, which really caught the public imagination and got people to think in around 2019, was, and Greta Thunberg and the school strikes, etc., was hugely important. Um, even to sort of stayed inside organisations like Green Alliance. So I'd say, many of our staff are involved in those activities as sort of individuals as well. So the politics strand has grown, and we've always had a role of convening the environment sector, working closely with Wildlife and Countryside Link and the Climate Coalition. I think there's sometimes a view of there's all these environment NGOs, why don't they cooperate? And actually they do. In a way, there's an argument there's sort of too much convening, and we trip over each other to convene. But Green Alliance's role has always been informal. In spite of the name, we're not an alliance. There's individuals who can join Green Alliance, and they listen to an annual report. And you're all most welcome to join, but we don't have a lot of individual members. We have a business circle with some businesses that pay £1,000 a year. But the NGOs, if we convene them, it's just because kind of we always have, and there's a tradition. There's been a sort of mysterious sounding dinner of environment chief executives that's taken place for over 30 years that Green Alliance has convened, just to improve relationships and cooperation among the big NGOs.
Mm.
And we you mentioned the dinner we had with Ed Miliband. We had sort of two during the Brexit saga with Michael Gove. We're very cross-party. Got one coming up with Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary. It's just really useful to be able to sit down off the record and talk openly with politicians.
It's important to go cross-party as well, really. We've got to, talk to everyone and get people cooperating, because it's critical at the moment. So how can we get them cooperating?
Yeah, well, I guess that's the other thing. The last thing I'll sort of say, and then perhaps we have a discussion. I should say, by the way, on the policy, the mention of biomass alarmed me earlier. I mean, we have some incredibly clever policy analysts and policy experts. So any sort of particularly difficult questions, I will note down and get back to people. But we have sort of grown quite a lot. So we now have 40 members of staff, and there's quite a lot of the policy analysts we get are sort of super bright recent PhDs who are just incredibly effective, but certainly go into the depth of policy that I, as a generalist, don't. So on the politics, I think it's really curious what's happened in the last few years, because support for environmental action has held up pretty well. I would say it's probably no longer in opinion polls a sort of top 3 issue. It's more like a top 5 issue. It would have more salience this week now it's in the news than other times. But people are worried about the environment. They are worried about the impact on their grandchildren, and they're worried about climate change. They're not stupid. They can see what's happening with the weather. And there are other issues that you can get into. So people don't like waste. They don't like having a kind of wet wipe island in the middle of the Thames. They don't like air pollution. They are worried about energy security, and you can sell a way of sort of the energy climate action will bring down bills or improve quality of life, etc. But at the same time as public opinion has held up, there's just been this incredible and really well-funded onslaught on climate action in particular. And in particular, I think on the figure of Ed Miliband, Red Ed, the climate secretary, who, if those of you who don't read every day the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail or the Sun, will be relatively unaware of the extent to which he is vilified and people are out to get him. So there's a really strong and well-funded campaign against net zero in particular. What you don't find is that very often is that people talk about climate. They talk about net zero as a sort of technocratic policy that has nothing to do with real people. At the last Conservative Party conference, I, like a sort of deranged groupie, followed Jacob Rees-Mogg and David Frost and others round the fringe, and never did they talk about climate. It was always net zero as this thing that's being done to people that has nothing to do with their lives. And of course, this has had an impact, and we've seen it in the States as well. We've seen it in other countries where climate has become a kind of culture war issue, a division between left and right, or progressives and traditionalists. It's not yet there in the opinion polls, but it's definitely there now in our politics. So reform voters, committed reform voters, are probably very skeptical about net zero. The waverers, the so-called reform curious, particularly the people in the red wall, the people who voted Conservative in 2019, voted Labour in 2024, and are wavering now about whether to go to reform, that really important segment of voters that obsesses Labour strategists and Number 10 and Morgan McSweeney, they are not particularly net zero skeptic. They're quite happy to go along with climate policies, provided they don't cost too much, provided they don't inconvenience themselves them too much. But they are, they worry about climate change like most people. It's only the really committed reform voters who've kind of swung off into deep skepticism. But we did in the UK have this great climate consensus and a sense of cross-party pride that we'd signed the Climate Change Act, that we hosted as what I think in retrospect seen as a broadly successful COP in COP26 in Glasgow. That is now fractured. So the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, I think one of the only people who spoke in the Commons against net zero when Theresa May's government brought it in. She's always been skeptical. She grew more skeptical as trade secretary when she was lobbied by the energy intensive industries, saying that net zero policies were loading costs onto them and making them uncompetitive. And the Conservatives have, of course, now not only said they're no longer committed to net zero by 2050, but they campaign quite vigorously against it. I get regular fundraising emails from the Conservative Party, and quite often they're highlighting kind of net zero policies as being very destructive of the economy and of people's quality of life. So that's a real problem for us. We work really closely as Green Alliance with a lot of Green Conservatives. We hosted a private roundtable of Green Conservatives about how to get the policy back on track. We talk regularly with the Conservative Environment Network. There is a big caucus within the Conservative Party that is very worried about the drift to net zero skepticism and very proud of their record, particularly under Boris Johnson, who, whatever else you think about him, did care about this agenda and about nature. But party loyalty is a strong thing, and I think we've got a real concern under the current Conservative leadership. Reform, I probably don't need to say much about it. I mean, they are campaigning vigorously now against net zero. They're saying it's loading costs onto people. They're blaming it on. They're saying that it's the cause of deindustrialization, as if the coal mines were closed because of net zero, as if we haven't been losing jobs in the steel industry for 20 or 30 years. The reality is that if UK industry is to be saved, it'll be saved because the world is investing quickly in decarbonisation. China is racing ahead, and there's a really strong green growth argument for doubling down on these policies and not for looking back to a kind of fossil-fueled past. But that message certainly isn't getting across with Reform UK. Oddly enough, on the 17th floor of Millbank Tower, and we're on the 18th floor. So quite often I bump into these people, and if there's a smell of smoke in the lift, you know that Nigel is in the building. But I fear we've failed to get much of a dialogue with them. And then um, the Lib Dems and the Greens, it'd be interesting to hear what you all think about that. I think we certainly would like them to be a louder voice on this, and I think more generally, probably on making the case of progressive politics. I saw today a letter that Ed Davies written actually about a different issue about refugees and about standing against the kind of uh, worsening of community tensions that we've seen in the last few weeks. And I thought that was really good and the sort of role you want from opposition parties, and like to see it from all parties. But on climate, I think they've failed either to say enough or to get enough cut through.
I had a question there for you. This new Jeremy Corbyn's your party. Now, membership figures, I think Reform, you mentioned them, they've gone up to like 300,000 members or something. And obviously, there's an unaddressed need there that people are joining, there's concerns and things. So apparently, I'm not sure Conservative what their membership figures are, but I think something around 150, 200,000, 200,000. Apparently, so also, what's the other one? Apparently, 800,000 people have joined up. It was 500,000 when I checked a few days ago. It's 800,000 now have joined your party. Do you want to say a little bit about? I know that about that. I know that tonight there's a meeting at the same time. There's people from Time to Assemble, which are working on people's assemblies linking up all around the country, and Citizens Assembly are having a meeting with the Your Party people to discuss cooperations and assemblies and things. I'm a big fan of getting as many assemblies as going as we can and feeding into local and national government so we can all share ideas. What do you think about this new contender on the political scene of the Yes Party? We don't know enough yet, but say a bit of that, and then on the government, then we'll go to Q&A. Over.
Okay, great. Well, as you know, we're non-party, and you're recording this, so I'll be careful. I don't think they've got 800,000 members. I think they've had 800,000 people express an interest and give their email address. But I
Okay.
guess the hope is that, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of the concern of the parties is about a relatively narrow group of voters in the red wall, so-called red wall, um, and the role that UKIP played very effectively, very disastrously from my point of view, but very effectively before the Brexit referendum, was to pull the centre of political gravity towards Euroscepticism. Nobody thought they were going to get into government, and they didn't even get any MPs elected, though they had a couple across the floor to become MPs. But they were really effective at shifting the political balance. At the moment, and this is partly why I say we'd like to hear more from the Greens and Lib Dems on who both got ambitious climate policies, more on from them, is I don't think the Labour government feels an electoral threat from, as it were, the progressive side of environmental policies or other politics. Whereas they do feel an electoral threat from the right and from the climate skeptic policies of reform. So if the new party can shift the centre of gravity and get people kind of more engaged with progressive politics, including on climate, then I guess that would have a positive impact. We'll have to see how it goes. Certainly, we worked well. To the extent we could engage with Jeremy Corbyn when he was Labour leader, we had a constructive meeting with him. I think John McDonnell is not signed up to the new party, but John McDonnell had some really interesting ideas as Shadow Chancellor. I think the manifestos Labour went into in 2017, 2019, kind of, they were really ambitious on climate. So there is a
Mm.
level of ambition there, which we would welcome. I say on the government, because I sort of fear here that I'm going to sound like a Labour apologist, but one of the things that's increasingly worried me in the last few months is that the Labour government has pushed ahead with some pretty ambitious environmental policies, not as ambitious as people on this call or the environmental NGOs would like, of course, because it's got its 5 missions. The number 1 mission is economic growth. It wants to build 1.5 billion homes. It's got lots and lots of different policies, and the clean power mission is only one of their 5 emissions. But in really difficult economic circumstances and in really difficult electoral circumstances, with the campaigning against these policies from the Conservatives and Reform, they've stuck with it. And Keir Starmer at the Energy Security Summit a couple of months ago said that clean power was in Labour's DNA. In the spending review settlement, Ed Miliband's department got a bigger uplift than any other department, 16% uplift in a really difficult spending review, more than health, more than defence, including full funding for the warm homes plan, which is going to be a cool homes plan as well now, in view of the the government have got the message that we need cool, summer cooling as well as winter warming.
Mm.
So we got the setting up of GB Energy. There's a whole lot of things, the onshore wind ban, setting up, putting Chris Stark, formerly of the Climate Change Committee, in charge of the clean power mission, clean power by 2030 remaining a full commitment. There's a whole lot of really, really ambitious stuff that's going on in the Department of Energy, Security, Net Zero. There will be people who don't like the emphasis on nuclear power. There'll be people who don't like the investment in carbon capture and storage, although, of course, they are very popular with the trade unions, and the trade unions are rightly worried about losing good unionized jobs in fossil fuels for what are often not as good unionized jobs in renewable energy. And I think one of the things that we've been saying, and increasingly I think the government are saying, is that the renewable businesses need to recognize unions and need to give good paying conditions. Otherwise you will have GMB and other unions understandably skeptical about the impact that these policies have on their members. On the I think there was a question about Steve Reed there. On the DEFRA agenda, Department of Energy, Food and Rural Affairs, I am really encouraged by what they're doing on the circular economy, which I say Green Alliance has been banging on about with very little success for 12 years. They have set up a circular economy task force. My colleague Libby Peake, who's our head of resources policy, is on the task force. We'll have to see what they come up with. We'd like more action now. There's no reason to delay the ban on plastic and wet wipes and things like that. But they are committed to that policy. They've signed up to the Oceans Treaty. They've signed up to a ban on bottom trawling. They've banned neonicotinoids, if I said that right, neonics anyway, in farming. They banned lead in lead shot, which is something people have been talking about for 10 or 15 years. In farming policy, they got a good settlement in the spending review for farming on the condition that it's devoted to public goods. So they need to meet the Environment Act targets of beginning to restore nature by 2030, and farming policy will be crucial to that. So that's going to be a greener farming policy with more or less the same funding as before. Bill payers will pay for this, but the £104 billion that's going to be invested over the next 5 years by water companies could have a huge impact on the natural environment if it's devoted to nature-based solutions and natural flood management.
Nature-based solutions, absolutely, and then the flood plans need work. Yeah,
I mean that will dwarf what's spent from the Environmental Land Management Scheme, the former Common Agricultural Policy. They're committed to a food strategy along the lines of that proposed by Henry Dimbleby under the last government. They're committed to a land use framework, which the last report I oversaw when I was chief executive of CPRE 8 years ago was calling for a land use framework to, so there's a whole lot of really, really positive stuff going on. There are other things that are less positive, of course, and then there's a big concern about the planning bill that's going through. But again, they have listened to the campaign run by RSPB, Wildlife Trust, and others, and they brought forward amendments. And a government with a 150-seat majority doesn't necessarily need to do that, and they've been absolutely traduced for doing it by those who want to build everywhere, regardless of the environmental consequences. So, although it's not perfect, there is a dialogue going on, and so I'll end on that. But I just think we should accentuate the positive a little bit, given that actually the onslaught they're under from those who actually want really retrograde environmental policies. Keep the pressure up, but don't sort of view them totally as the enemy, I think, is my message.
There's an old phrase from the Eskimos: "We have no enemies, only confused friends." As someone said in one of our circles once.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I feel like I've learned a lot in just this hour. I'm the Young Greens officer in the Exeter Green Party. And I'm concerned because we don't accept any money. We only gather from like grassroots funding sources. So we don't have access to like BlackRock funding and anonymous crypto donations. And I wonder, will this leave us behind, or will this like impact our ability to pull and influence policy in government? Because more often than not, politicians are acting in the interests of their funders. So how does that affect the playing field for us like that support the Green Alliance? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, it's not easy being ethical, is it? In a way, I should say, Green Alliance. I think we are quite picky about where we take our money, and we we certainly not got any BlackRock money or crypto, and we list all our funders in our annual report. We've always, as Green Alliance, we've always tried to be a bridge with businesses, so businesses look like they're sincere about doing the change, because we've got, I suppose, a lot of the targets we're dealing with the 2030. And I know there's a lot of big arguments about degrowth and overturning capitalism and having an entirely new system. But that takes quite some time. So if you really want to work in the next 5 years to achieve transformative change, you're going to have to work with existing businesses. And well, certainly Green Alliance isn't going to be fomenting the revolution, even if others are. Um, uh, but we used to have in our business circle, Shell and BP. We did a big report with Heathrow. I think actually, again, it's a consequence of the sort of change politics after 2019 that we don't any longer take money from fossil fuel companies, even if they've got sort of big renewable operations. And we don't work with Heathrow anymore either, although we have a dialogue. We keep a dialogue with them. But I'm sorry, I'm waffling now. I just think you're right that the forces the forces of evil are much better funded than the forces of good, I'm afraid. But we've got the people, they've got the money.
True, we do have the people. Yeah, that is very true.
I think we need to really look at the money in politics. When you've got billionaires who can pile loads of money into reform, and on the American side, they had that one where, political action groups of anonymous billionaires can pile money into either side. It skews politics when someone's got so much money put into their party, and particularly things like Cambridge Analytica and the rest.
Sean, I mean, you very rightly pointed out how the far right and reform try never to talk about climate change and merely go on about this faceless net zero. And I know that some people on this network are actually in areas like Durham, where they've got councils who are now going full on climate skeptic. My question really is how, from your point of view at the political centre, how can the people in the grassroots actually focus back on climate change and the fact that the climate is demonstrably getting worse without getting sucked into net zero arguments? Is there any thoughts you might have on how we might develop shared messages, and how do we work with the bigger NGOs?
It's the big question, Chris. And there's a lot of talk going on now, a lot of meetings. Green Alliance is sort of tangentially involved between various NGOs about how we can fight back. And there's a whole level of expertise on popular campaigning and reaching voters that Green Alliance doesn't have. We're a sort of elite Westminster-based think tank. We talk to politicians. We draw on opinion research, and we've done some today on the circular economy, but we wouldn't pretend to be the people who kind of understand how to get messages across on social media or kind of fight back on TikTok or anything like that. That's not our niche, but there are a lot of groups that are thinking about that. Climate outreach, the Around Our Way, the energy ECIU, Energy and Climate Information Unit. There's a whole lot of comms outfits out there that are trying to agree on the messaging. From my point of view, I think that it would be a mistake for the environment movement to do what the government has really done, with the exception of Ed Miliband, but certainly the Prime Minister will never talk about climate. He will just say this is about energy security, about bills, about jobs, about growth, about the kind of grassroots issues that appeal to most voters. But I think actually that climate is something people are concerned about, and they're going to get more and more concerned as we see more and more the impacts of climate change here and across the world. So I think it would be a mistake for us to decouple. I think the policies we espouse need to be seen to be good for people, good for jobs, good for lower bills, good for air quality, etc., and socially just, and not just sort of middle class policies. They've got to carry everybody with them. You can't have people thinking this is a sort of middle class indulgence that's about something abstract like climate change when people are worried about putting food on their table. So all of that is really important, and is probably the biggest part of the message. But to decouple it from what it's really all about, which is trying to stop catastrophic climate change, would be a mistake. The last thing I'd just say on reform, one of the really interesting things that's happening at the moment with the new mayors and the new reform councils is, of course, when they look, particularly in Humberside or even Lincolnshire, at the number of jobs that are bound up with the transition to net zero, they're not sort of saying, oh, we want to axe all these jobs. They're leaning into it. The new mayor of, I think it's the Humber, is kind of saying this is great, we want all these jobs, and is joining up with other regional mayors to promote net zero policies. So he's not sort of calling it that. There's a brilliant, I'm not sure how easy it is as a fine, but there was a brilliant video that the TUC put out with a car worker saying to Reform, why are you after my job? A car worker working in an electric vehicle factory. So I think the more we can get those sorts of messages across, that this is just like slightly odd that you would turn down this transition, which is bringing loads of investment, loads of jobs, good quality jobs in most cases. Why would a political party try to stop that and become more dependent on imported oil and gas instead? It's odd.
That's great. I mean, I think it is something that every group on this network really does need to think about, though. And I think we need to kind of really smarten up our comms, because we're certainly losing the social media battle, which may not be a battle any of us actually want to fight. But I think really getting to the councillors and the people who are local decision makers and just pointing out the benefits is something we have to be a bit more strategic about. Anyway, thanks, Shaun. It was a great talk.
I certainly, Chris, I absolutely think the social media battle is a fight we have to win. And I mean, I'd say it's not Green Alliance's bailiwick, and there are others working on it, but it's really, unless we win that battle, given where people now get their news from, if we just concentrate on the Today programme and the newspapers, etc., then we're not going to win.
I think Anne Cruikshank's got a very good question there, and something close to my heart. I've been, if we want to win the general public, a lot of people are concerned about, you have to use plainer language so that everyone can understand, and also reach out to people where they are, which is trying to feed the kids and pay the rent or the mortgage the other week.
I mean, it's sort of about technocratic language, isn't it? So it's about to what extent. I mean, terms like retrofitting, a particular, something I'm very interested in, but it's not a term that people relate to. Retrofitting and net zero, people don't really understand what it means. But if you can distill that into relatable things that people can engage with, then although obviously that's messaging for the individuals, but if you can feed those sound bites into the politicians, then presumably that's a much more positive way of actually engaging and perhaps creating momentum and dealing with the loony right.
Yeah, look, absolutely, I agree with that. I've been in sort of think tank world too long to the technocratic language has entered my soul. But
no, it's easy for all of us to do because we talk about it all the time. But I'm just, if you're an average person, it's.
But actually, in our new Green Alliance strategy, we've got a commitment to do more on strategic comms and more on messaging, which is it is not a change. It's not that we are going as Green Alliance to start talking to the general public, but we are talking to MPs who are talking to the general public.
Exactly. So you can feed their messages,
Yeah, but the MPs are being influenced by the TikToks as much as the voters are, actually. And so we need to be, we're not going to be TikToking ourselves, but we need to be aware that that's where they're getting the information from.
Yeah, I mean, and that unfortunately gets you down into the sort of the 15-second soundbite sort of territory, doesn't it? But at least if you can feed them stuff that they can use. I had one other very flippant comment, which is in view of some of the comments that Rachel Reeves has been making recently, do we need to start a mass campaign to all send her copies of the Dasgupta review?
Yeah, that's good to review. I think in his forward, he said we all need to become naturalists. And it kind of, when Rachel Reeves the other day said that she cares more about people than snails, and it's just sort of so insulting and reductive. Keir Starmer has cooled that rhetoric. Keir Starmer's war on bats and jumping spiders, I think, has cooled, and the message has got to him that why it's not winning any support. It's just alienating people who would actually quite like to work with the government. But Rachel Reeves, unfortunately, hasn't got that message, and it's a real problem. She is a problem as the Chancellor, because she just doesn't appear to get this agenda.
Do you have any thoughts about how to address that?
I
mean, she's the gatekeeper to the finances, isn't she? So
yeah, actually, I suppose I'm slightly unfair and say she doesn't get the agenda, because she has given good spending settlements to DESNZ and the Department of Energy, Security, Net Zero, and also Department of Environment. So she's done some good things. She is absolutely obsessed with planning reform, and we mentioned that I worked for CPRE before, and I don't believe that if you simply do what the centre-right think tanks have been advocating for 20 years, which is liberalise planning and make it easier to build anywhere, that you're going to get the buildings you want. Scrap the green belt, and the house builders will build about the same number of homes they currently build, because that's what they want to build, and that's their economic model, and that'll keep prices up. They'll just build them on green spaces rather than where people need them in inner cities. That's a fundamental disagreement with Rachel Reeves. I think she thinks that if you ripped up planning, which is what the Policy Exchange and the Centre for Policy Studies and the Institute of Economic Affairs and all these kind of very free market think tanks have been advocating for years, you'll get lots of development. And the last government tried it for 14 years, didn't work, and it won't work with this government. And I just don't understand why she doesn't get it. But she's obviously desperate for growth, and I understand why she's desperate for growth.
Just so we've got about 11-12 minutes left. I think Dinah's got a question there, so keep your answers and questions and answers succinct, shall we say? Sorry, plain language, slightly shorter. And I think Alex P's got a point there, and particularly then on maybe to James Hewitt and Rosie Dodds. Dinah.
Okay, about the planning stuff, in Wales, they've got this Future Generations Act. Do you think that there's any way the Green Alliance could lobby for something like that here? Because in the absence of a ministry for the environment, we really need a law that will limit what people can do with planning. The Future Generations Act seems to be a really good way forward.
Yeah, we did an online webinar on the Future Generations Act with the previous commissioner. I forget her name, and we have recommended something of that sort in the in our report on the Dasgupta review. So yeah, everybody loves the Future Generations Act from Wales, except apparently the Welsh voters, if you look at opinion polls at the moment. But yeah.
Okay. Just to mention, I'll find the link in a sec, but Shaun's written a book on countryside and planning. We'll try and put that link in there. And I'd just like to chip in. We would love to see some of the many empty buildings, hundreds of thousands of empty buildings, repurposed and reused before they build lots more, because it's more environmentally better to reuse what we've got.
Thank you, Shaun. I just want to raise the issue of your analysis of British politics is fairly spot on, but I think what's missing in it is identifying why our politicians haven't got climate top of the agenda. And I disagree that the public is, there is, even the Reform voters, the research today found that the Reform voters are actually large majority back climate action and renewable energy. What has happened over the last 5 years is all of the major paper owners and editors have replaced Brexit with net zero, a campaign to destroy net zero. And I think that's what has happened to the Tory party, and to and Reform are speaking to that agenda. So what's happened is the media have replaced the Tories with Reform as their desired next government. And we're facing, in a way, a right-wing coup that is actually anti-climate action as well as everything else. And so my question, sorry, is that what is Green Alliance doing about tackling the media owners and the media editors on the right wing who have decided that net zero is their top target to destroy? Are you engaging with them? Are you talking to them? Are you including them in any conferences or round tables that you're doing? Because I think these are the most powerful politicians in Britain. And I'm just wondering what you are doing as somebody at the centre of the political agenda on climate are doing. Thank you.
It's a really good challenge. The answer is we're not, and we probably should be. We are talking to the other groups who are kind of set up to do this. So there are one of the problems with NGOs is there are a lot of us, and we trip over each other. And Green Alliance tries quite hard to bring people together to play to their strengths and to avoid duplication and unnecessary competition. So, say ECIU set up to deal with the media. There's the Climate Centre, which is set up specifically to deal with particularly the sort of red top media, and occasionally I've been on GB News, sort of set up by the Climate Centre because they want people to go on it. But we haven't, I think, as a movement, done enough with the editors. Whether the editors would see us, I don't know. But there, as I say, there are lots of talk going on at the moment about how we can do better on comms and recognising the importance of the well, as you say, the sort of silent coup that seems to be going on at the moment. But it's a good challenge. It's a good challenge. But I'll go back and think about whether we, as Green Alliance, can do more on it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I would argue that those two organisations that you've mentioned, they focus on the coverage and the output of the media. We argue that nobody's really thinking about the leadership. I think we're all afraid of actually asking for a meeting with the editors or the owners. That's what Lawson did when he got the coalition to face their guns on the green crap. He invited out the editor of the Daily Mail and persuaded them, you need to attack the green crap. And that's why we had ended up with 9 million homes uninsulated. I think we as a movement are missing the most powerful political players in our country. I think we keep thinking, how do we get the public on board? We've won that. We won it 10 years ago. They're on board. Even the Reform voters are on our side. But the politics are not, because the people, I think, driving the politics are the front pages of the tabloids, and Starmer is terrified of them. He's working for them, not for us. How do we tackle that? I think the biggest issue in the climate movement that I would love to see addressed. And thank you for being open-minded about it. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I think about it. I have tried to meet my old friend Michael Gove, who's now editing The Spectator, but I guess the Sun has more power. Yeah, okay, that's a really good challenge. Thank you.
Tessa's first, which is, what are you doing to counter the motor lobby that portrays private cars freedom and brushes off the environmental impact of fossil fuel transport, including battery-driven ones? So it's very environmentally costly in the manufacturing process. So how would you counter it? Yeah.
Just to say, we had, I think it was Stephen Joseph from the Campaign for Better Transport outlined massively on a webinar a couple of months ago how we could be putting a lot of this money into public transport and trains. And, you know, Europe's given free trains in several countries. Some cities have completely free public transport. So how can we rebalance this a bit with the private motor lobby and policies and government influence, shall we say, and funding? Over.
Yeah, we push quite a lot on bus travel and the £2 bus fare, and we're in a select committee report that's been produced today. Our evidence is cited. We've worked with Trainline on train travel. We've been sort of tacitly supportive through our Transport Roundtable with some of the Transport Action Network Campaign for Better Transport campaigning on new roads, and more than tacitly, we've supported those campaigns. And personally, I'm outraged by the Lower Thames crossing, which is not far from me in Kent. But I think we have been enthusiastic about the transition to electric vehicles. That you know, people will drive. Not going to stop people driving. The UK car industry is enormously important for many communities and for the economy. If we lose those, if we don't lean into the transition, we'll be the last country in Europe producing fossil fuel cars, and then the car industry will collapse. So we're trying to push to go big on electric vehicles, which will have along with heat pumps, electric vehicles are they're the two areas of policy where the most carbon saving are to be had. So they're crucially important to getting on track to net zero. What we have said about EVs, because of the difficulty of critical raw materials and the finite nature and now the campaigns for deep sea mining to get them and the terrible labor conditions in the Congo, et cetera, is we've had a big push to recycle and reuse critical raw materials. That's partly why we were involved in the campaign against disposable vapes, because of all the critical raw materials wasted there. So at the moment, we send critical raw materials abroad to be recycled elsewhere. We need recycling facilities in this country, and that'll help the EV transition. But there's no pain-free or problem-free path to decarbonisation, including electric vehicles.
Could you see the UK pushing for policies like, I think Germany brought in €9 to go anywhere on a train in Germany, and the car traffic dropped by 30% or something, and the pollution. How can we push for better public transport, more investment in public transport? And there's certain cities and countries, maybe Luxembourg, maybe some other cities, have brought in completely free public transport. Could we see that in the UK one day?
Well, I'd love to, and Transport Action Network did a brilliant report on how public transport solutions would be more effective than building the Lower Thames crossing. But I think the context for all this is that the country's broke, and there's a huge, this is cliche, huge black hole. I mean, the Chancellor is absolutely not knowing how she's going to honour her pledge not to raise taxes on working people without the country going broke in the budget. So I just think it's going to be really, really hard to get public investment in any of these things, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying with the economy and things, but we also, I think Dale Vince's campaign to tax the billionaires might raise a couple of quid. All right.
Yeah, absolutely. But we need more than a couple of quid. I mean, I'd love all this stuff.
I think they've got a few more than a couple. Okay, I think thank you so much for coming. As someone said, we've learned a lot tonight, to know how the gears of government work a bit more in influence and policy and things. We have to work together at all levels of society to cooperate. And I'm really glad Green Alliance is talking about the solutions. So
thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry I was so long-winded in my response and so on, but nice. I'm going to download all the questions and read them. And if anybody wants to get in touch, I guess, how to get hold of me. I hope you do.
Thank you. Absolute pearls of wisdom. And we've learned a lot. So keep in touch. We would definitely, last point ready for me, we would love to talk to you about a policy that makes recycling and reusing empty property as a standard policy, that if it's going to be empty for 1, 2, 3 years, it should be given to environment, community groups to build the circular economy, to build the local, green economy, whatever it is. Give local communities space and you will see an amazing thing happen. We'll definitely get in touch to talk to you about that. Shaun, thank you so much.